Miles Benton rose with the sun, as he had every day for the past 20 years. The farmhouse windows framed mist crawling over open pastures, the land breathing in silence. It was the kind of quiet that most people had to drive hours to find. He stepped out with his coffee, boots crunching on gravel, and made his way toward the southern fence to check on the cattle feed bins. Something was off. He slowed as he approached the line where his land met the neighboring property or used. 2. The fence didn't look right. It was straighter, newer, and worse. It had moved. He crouched next to one of the fresh posts. The soil was still loose, shovel marks visible in the dirt. It wasn't a repair. It was a new installation, and the post now stood several feet inside his property line. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing as they scanned across the stretch. More stakes, more posts. A straight line cut through his pasture like it belonged there. At first, he considered calling his neighbor, but the land south of him wasn't residential. It had been up for sale for years, too hilly for farming, too isolated for commercial builds. As he walked back toward the barn, he noticed something even stranger: bright pink flags fluttering near the north slope. Miles hadn't seen those yesterday. A white truck idled at the edge of the field, its doors marked with a development company's logo he didn't recognize. He approached, cautious but steady. A man in a hard hat stepped out and greeted him with a practiced smile. "You must be the neighbor. This'll be a beautiful place once it's done," the man said, waving toward the hill. "Gated community, walking trails, shared pool, and look at that view. Nothing but green for miles." Miles kept his expression still. "This is my land." The man blinked, smile faltering for just a second. "According to our survey, this parcel's part of the new plot. Our paper clean. I think your fence was just off by a few yards." Miles didn't respond. He turned and walked back without another word. But a cold pressure settled between his shoulders. That night, he pulled out the original plat maps and deed documents. The fence hadn't been off. He had marked the borders himself when he bought the place. Using records that hadn't changed in a century, he spent hours flipping through pages, checking coordinates, old survey lines, notations made in faded ink. Everything matched his memory. His border was clear. By morning, the flags had multiplied. He drove into town and asked for the property filings at the county office. The clerk searched the database, then frowned. "Looks like there was a boundary adjustment filed last week. New documents list the southern edge of your land, starting 30 feet north of where it used to." Miles's voice remained level. "Who filed it?" She scanned the screen. "Name says Miles Benton." He stared at her. "I never signed anything." She looked uncomfortable. "There's a digital copy of your signature." A strange silence stretched between them. Miles thanked her, walked out, and didn't say another word until he was back home, staring out at the land that was no longer fully his. The fence had moved, but it wasn't the only thing shifting. He could feel that something deeper had taken root, and it was just beginning to grow. The air was different now. The usual stillness of the land had turned brittle, like something under tension about to snap. Miles Benton spent the next morning walking the southern edge of his property with a surveyor's tape in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Every step confirmed what he already knew. The markers were off. The line had shifted, and none of it added up. But numbers didn't land, neither did the fact that strangers were now building on ground he never sold. He made a second visit to the county records office. This time he didn't speak to a clerk. He went straight to the registrar's window and demanded to see the full chain of title for the disputed area. The older man behind the glass glanced up, saw Miles's face, and said nothing as he printed out a stack of pages at a nearby table. Miles flipped through them one by one. The names were unfamiliar. The dates were recent, and his own signature appeared on a filing just 16 days old, complete with a notary stamp from a woman he'd never met. The registrar returned with a frown. "Everything looks legal on the surface," he said. "But if you're saying this isn't your signature, you'll need to get an expert involved." Miles nodded once and tucked the pages into his folder. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, the papers spread around him. The handwriting didn't match his. The digital notary stamp linked to a city hundreds of miles away. Something felt rotten beneath the surface clean forms, disguising a theft in slow motion. A week later, the first slab foundation appeared. A full construction crew arrived, setting up steel frames and a portable office trailer. When Miles approached the foreman and asked for a copy of the permit, the man shrugged. "Everything's already cleared. We're just here to build." "But who gave the clearance?" Miles asked. The foreman gave a name, someone from the zoning board who Miles knew had retired 2 years ago. The next morning, a glossy brochure was delivered to every mailbox in town. On the cover, an artist's rendering of a luxury neighborhood, perched on scenic farmland, wide streets, designer homes, a central clubhouse with a rooftop view of rolling hills. His hills. The name made his jaw clench. Benton Hills Estates. Inside, a note promised future buyers access to exclusive walking trails and community pools overlooking protected green space. They were selling the view from his land like it belonged to them. Miles stood at the edge of the dirt road that night, staring out at the slow crawl of trucks and rebar. His land, carved up by someone else's dream. And somewhere, in an office he couldn't yet see, someone had made this happen paper by paper, stamp by stamp. But they hadn't planned for resistance. They thought he'd roll over. They thought he was just another quiet landowner with no fight in him. They'd mistaken stillness for surrender. He walked back inside, pulled the deed from his drawer, and called a name he hadn't spoken in years, an old friend, who once won a case over a zoning fight no one else thought could be won. Call ended. He looked back out at the porch. The light from the construction site glowed faintly over the trees. The fight wasn't just about land anymore. It was about every lie they buried beneath it. By Monday, the humming of machinery had become part of the landscape. Miles could hear it through the walls of his barn, pulsing like the rhythm of something alive and feeding. Cement mixers groaned before dawn. Nail guns popped in rapid bursts. He watched them through binoculars, cataloging everything. But the most unsettling thing wasn't the speed of construction, it was the boldness. The development had pushed deeper. Wooden beams framed what would soon become the HOA clubhouse. The location sat squarely in what had once been his grazing field. They hadn't just redrawn a line. They'd erased it altogether. His attorney, Ruth Chalmers, arrived that afternoon. She was direct, sharp-eyed, and methodical. A folder in her hand, she walked the property with Miles as he explained everything, dates, names, signatures that weren't his. She stopped beside the poured foundation near the hill's edge and crouched down, scanning the exposed corner of a buried marker. "This stone's original," she muttered. "Surveyors don't bury them anymore. You've got proof right here." Miles nodded. They didn't even bother to look, just drew new lines and called it done. Back at the farmhouse, Ruth spread out her own set of documents. "The deed forgery is messy, but forgery alone won't stop them fast enough. We need more. I think they're building on land still legally owned by you, but we'll have to prove it's within your active holding, not just disputed acreage. I'll get a surveyor with court credentials. In the meantime, don't approach the workers again. Let them keep digging." She paused, then added, "Let them dig their own trap." Over the next few days, Miles visited City Hall, hoping for a quiet solution. He asked to speak with the zoning officer. The receptionist smiled awkwardly and said appointments were full for the week. When he asked for the permits on file, she told him to submit a formal request. "They were just here this morning," Miles said quietly. "3 men with briefcases and 2 suitcases of documents." She only smiled again. "Our records are in transition. Please use the online portal." At the diner, locals avoided eye contact. He overheard them talking about how the town would finally get new traffic lights, how property values would spike, how Benton's land had always been underused. At the gas station, a stranger complimented the view behind his barn and said he couldn't wait to move in. "They say the HOA is going to be strict about lawn colors and mailbox designs." The man said, laughing, "I'm just glad they saved that ridge out back. Beautiful sightline." Miles didn't answer. He filled his tank and drove off, his mind racing. It wasn't just the HOA. The entire town had already sold itself to the idea of Benton Hills. He was the last one who hadn't signed on, and maybe the only one who still could stop it. That night, a drone hovered over his house. It passed once, then again, buzzing faintly like a fly circling something it mistook for dead. He stepped out with a flashlight, tracked it with the beam until it drifted off toward the construction zone. He didn't know if it belonged to the developers, the HOA, or the realtor firm, but someone was watching. Inside, Ruth sent a text. "County filings flagged for backdated entries. I've seen this before. They're sloppy. We'll use it." Miles sat in his kitchen, lights off, staring out at the glowing frames of houses rising on stolen ground. They thought this was just paperwork, but paper burns. Land doesn't. The courthouse. Steps echoed under Ruth Chalmers' boots as she returned from the archive basement, a thin binder clutched in her arms like it held something living. Miles had waited outside in the truck, watching workers pour concrete onto land that still carried his name in ink. They hadn't bothered to check. When she climbed into the cab, she said nothing at first. She opened the binder and laid it across his lap. "This is what they missed," she said. Inside, yellowed pages crackled with age. A notarized copy of a 1927 deed, never digitized, never rescinded, showed a defined strip of land cutting through the entire southern slope. A hand-drawn map, delicate and precise, outlined a clear boundary. And on the final page was a clause neither of them had expected, a recorded visual easement, protected indefinitely, which prohibited the obstruction, development, or commercial use of the land for purposes that would diminish the natural view from the north side. In plain terms, the HOA had not only built on land that wasn't theirs, they'd marketed a scenic view that was legally protected. With Miles as its custodian, he turned to Ruth. "They built half their project on this." She nodded. "That clubhouse? Dead center pools inside the protected zone, in the marketing language they used. That alone opens them up to fraud." Miles didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But something in his posture changed. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just reacting, he was positioning. That afternoon, the licensed surveyor Ruth had hired arrived with gear slung over both shoulders, and an assistant in tow. They worked quietly, weaving back and forth through the property for hours, marking old boundary points, checking the angles, confirming GPS coordinates against paper records. By sunset, they had confirmed what Miles already knew: his original markers were accurate to the foot, and at least 16 acres of active development had spilled over into his legal territory. That night, Ruth drafted the initial complaint: trespass, illegal development, zoning manipulation, forgery, and civil damages. She included stills from the HOA's website, drone photos of the clubhouse construction, and scans of the 1927 deed. The next morning, a courier delivered the complaint to the HOA board president's office. Devin Crane, a man who had never once returned Miles's calls, received it directly in front of 2 visiting real estate agents. The courier's body cam, at Ruth's request, captured every second of the exchange. Devin paled, flipped through the pages, and muttered something unintelligible before slamming the office door. Within hours, the noise at the construction site slowed, but it didn't stop. On the 4th day, Miles noticed a black SUV parked at the edge of his driveway. 2 men inside pretended to check a map but didn't leave. That evening, his mailbox was pried open, its contents scattered across the ditch. Ruth told him not to engage. He moved his trail cameras closer to the road. Each step forward seemed to trigger a new form of pressure. The HOA didn't deny the filings, but they didn't halt anything either. The message was clear: delay, distract, finish fast. Get the homes built and sold before the truth could gain traction. But truth was already rooted and growing. That weekend, Ruth held a meeting in Miles's barn. She brought a laptop, projected documents on the weathered boards, and walked him through the next steps: injunction requests, discovery, and the subpoena of everyone tied to the fraudulent filings. She'd handled worse before, but even she admitted this one reeked of arrogance. As the last slide flicked off, Miles stood in the darkening barn, arms folded. They wanted the view, he said softly. Now they're going to have to see what comes with it. The cease and desist arrived just after sunrise, delivered by uniformed courier and signed by the county clerk. It carried the full weight of the initial findings: legal boundary encroachment, violations of the historic visual easement, and evidence of forged documentation. The HOA office received it in silence. Not a single crew member touched a shovel that day. From his porch, Miles watched the site stall like a great machine running out of steam. Workers stood in small groups, hands in their pockets, waiting for answers. Devin Crane didn't appear. His silver SUV remained parked behind the clubhouse all day, with the windows rolled up and the engine cold. But Miles wasn't celebrating. He knew this was only a pause, not a surrender. The following evening, he and Ruth sat in the kitchen, reviewing a new batch of evidence. Ruth had filed the preliminary lawsuit in circuit court and arranged for temporary restraining orders on any future construction within the disputed acreage. It was enough to lock things down for now. "There's something else," she said quietly. She slid a thin manila folder toward him. "Emails we pulled from the HOA servers during public data requests." Devin and 2 other board members had private exchanges with the zoning board 3 weeks before any permits were approved. One of the attachments was a zoning variance in Anzine, and then a second version with a forged signature. By 10 days, Miles didn't move. "You can prove it." "The metadata alone shows file manipulation," she replied. They knew what they were doing, and they thought no one would ever question it. By morning, the news had broken. Local headlines lit up with the story. Farm owner sues HOA over stolen land. Court finds forged paperwork. A few blogs picked it up, followed by talk radio and a local news crew that tried to reach the construction site. Security turned them away. The HOA remained silent, but Miles could see the cracks forming. The first visible sign came in the form of a for sale sign that vanished overnight from one of the newly framed homes. By the end of the week, 3 other properties were removed. From online listings, the developers were trying to minimize the fallout, but buyers were pulling out. Agents whispered to one another in coffee shops and hallways, hoping the damage would stop spreading. Ruth filed for expedited discovery, citing the forged variants and the HOA's continued refusal to comply with stop-work orders. The judge, now fully briefed, granted access to developer communications and banking records. That same afternoon, court officers visited the HOA office, collected hard drives, and served additional subpoenas to 2 members of the zoning committee. By that evening, construction officially halted. The equipment remained, but no one touched it. And still, the wind carried the scent of concrete dust over Miles's fields and finished structures, standing like monuments to a failed heist. Ruth called. Later that night, they offered a settlement. She said, "Quiet deal, no press. They'll pay damages if you give up the land." Miles stared out at the dark horizon, the moonlight casting long shadows across his fields. "They're trying to buy the view." "No, it's worth more than they can pay," Ruth agreed. He didn't need time to think. "Tell them no. They took my line. I'll redraw it myself." That weekend, he planted a fresh row of cypress trees along the original boundary. A quiet marker, tall and alive, rooted in truth. The development still stood, but the land beneath, it no longer belonged to the man. Soon, everyone would know just how far those roots reached. The courtroom was packed. Contractors, local reporters, investors, HOA members, and even former zoning staff filled the benches in tense rows. Miles sat near the front beside Ruth, the only one not flipping through papers or checking phones. He had brought no notes, no laptop, no tablet, just a silent stare that hadn't wavered since the trial began that morning. The judge, a seasoned man with a deep crease between his eyes, didn't bother with small talk. He addressed the room with the measured tone of someone who'd seen too many lies dressed as plans. First came the property maps. Ruth displayed side-by-side comparisons, one from the county's archive and one from the development's digital submission. The judge leaned forward as the boundary lines blinked slightly out of sync. Then came the signature analysis. A forensic handwriting expert confirmed that Miles's name on the boundary change form had been digitally copied and pasted. The court hushed when the experts stated, under oath, that the notary listed had died 2 years before the date on the document. Still, Devin Crane took the stand and insisted it was all a mistake. He claimed the paperwork had been handled by a third-party consultant. He said the HOA had no knowledge of any fraud and that the property's value had increased because of their improvements. At one point, he even tried to argue that the view was community property by spirit. Ruth didn't flinch. She let him talk. Then she calmly submitted printouts of marketing brochures, some quoting exact square footage on land that hadn't legally changed hands. She read aloud from emails where Crane told developers to fast-track approvals before the farmer wakes up. The words hung in the air. The courtroom didn't make a sound. In the final hour, Ruth introduced the 1927 easement deed. She read the clause aloud. The judge took the document, ran a finger over the aged parchment, and nodded once. When he delivered his ruling, he didn't hesitate. The court recognized Miles Benton as the sole legal owner of the disputed acreage. All structures on that land, including homes, sidewalks, and the central clubhouse, were deemed unlawfully constructed. The HOA and developer were found liable for civil trespass, fraud, and financial damages. Injunctions were issued immediately. Pending further litigation, Miles now had the right to assume possession or demand rent from all properties touching his boundary. For a moment, no one moved. The silence cracked only when someone in the back muttered, "He really won." Crane's attorney requested a delay. The judge denied it. The ruling was final. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, but Miles said nothing. Ruth answered what she could. The land was never for sale, she told one reporter. And now, those who built without respect must deal with the foundation. They ignored. That evening, eviction notices were prepared, not for the homeowner's but for the HOA office, the clubhouse, and the second pool. The judge's order gave Miles the right to lock, reclaim, or lease every inch of what was built across his southern fields. By morning, the clubhouse gate was chained shut. At least a dozen families began to panic. Their backyards, once facing a serene pasture, now overlooked warning signs and legal notices. Open house tours were canceled. Buyers backed out. Realtors pulled listings with trembling hands. The land had returned to its owner, but the community hadn't yet understood what that meant. From his kitchen window, Miles watched two men take photos of the new boundary markers. They didn't touch the trees. They didn't speak, and then they left. The line had been redrawn. But the next line, the one between ownership and control, was still being written. The clubhouse stood cold and silent now, its glass doors covered in reflective film to hide the emptiness within. A printed notice taped to the front confirmed what the judge had declared. The structure now belonged to Miles Benton. The HOA, no longer had access. A dozen calls had been made to reopen it. All of them went unanswered. Miles didn't need to answer. He was too busy. That Monday, he filed paperwork with the county registrar to lease sections of the disputed land, not the HOA, but to individual homeowners. Under personal contracts, the leases were high-priced, renewed annually, and included strict terms. No resale without notice, no modifications, and no assumption of permanent rights. Those who refused were notified that the structures beneath them were illegally repossessed. Soiled out at first, the HOA protested. Devin Crane issued a public letter accusing Miles of extortion, but no court would back them. They had lost the case, and the deeds were now being updated. The more they resisted, the worse it looked. The neighborhood, once quiet and proud, began to feel the cracks. Landscaping crews vanished. Pools remained drained. The once vibrant Benton Hills Community Board meetings turned into whispered, resentful gatherings where solutions were short and tempers shorter. Then something new appeared near the former clubhouse. A small wooden sign, hand-carved, was staked into the earth at the edge of the parking lot. Saturday market, local produce, and goods open to the public. It started with folding tables. Local farmers and vendors pulled up with crates of vegetables, eggs, honey, and jam. Miles brought hay bales and parked a trailer to sell compost and feed. The building, once a modern meeting space for HOA members, now housed shelves of fresh goods and a chalkboard calendar filled with events, seed swaps, workshops, and a monthly livestock trade day. The community was divided. Some neighbors hated the change, others saw the traffic it brought and joined in, setting up booths or renting out their driveways for guests. The development's identity began to shift from exclusivity to utility, and the control once held by an HOA president had turned to mud under Miles's boots. Even Devin Crane, who still lived in one of the larger homes on the south side, to face the reality, his property stood atop land he didn't own. He hadn't signed the lease. Miles sent the final notice himself, hand-delivered quietly slipped under Crane's door. No threats. No drama. Just a reminder that the land beneath his kitchen tiles and outdoor patio now fell under contract. Crane didn't respond. By month's end, 7 homeowners had accepted the lease. 3 had listed their homes at losses. 2 had already moved out. The banks were uneasy. The HOA's reserve fund, once meant for amenities and upgrades, now funneled into legal appeals and partial reimbursements. Miles bought a used flatbed truck and had a large water tank installed behind the clubhouse. He used it to irrigate a new row of berry shrubs lining the walking trail now renamed Harvest Path. Each week, more residents came to the market. Some pretended they weren't curious. Others brought cash and left with fresh bread, tomatoes, or local cheese. Miles never advertised. He didn't campaign. He didn't build fences or call press conferences. He simply used what had always been his. They had tried to sell the view. He gave them something to look at, and every step they took on that trail, every swing of a garden gate reminded them of the contract printed on the paper they once ignored. Summer came with dry heat and long shadows. The fields buzzed with crickets, and the market beside the old clubhouse grew busier with each passing week. What had once been a private retreat for HOA residents was now a weekend destination. Local musicians played under the eaves, and food trucks parked along the gravel loop. Miles had cut himself with his old tractor. No one in the HOA liked to admit it out loud, but they were attending his events. They were shopping in his stalls. The clubhouse they'd lost had more people inside it now than it ever did when it belonged to them. But something else had shifted too, something deeper. A letter arrived from the county clerk confirming approval of Miles's petition to form a special purpose land management district. It was obscure, legally dense, and nearly forgotten in modern use. But it gave one man, with majority land ownership and direct impact on a neighborhood's utilities, legal authority to oversee zoning recommendations, set infrastructure rules, and propose district-level adjustments, including HOA boundaries. Ruth sat with him at the table, rereading the final paragraph twice. "You're not just leasing land now," she said. "You're writing the rules." "I won't be harsh," Miles replied. "I'll just give them what they gave me. Contracts, inspections, and slow-moving red tape." She smiled faintly. "That's worse." By autumn, the lease agreements had grown. 15 homeowners now paid annual rent directly to Miles. 4 of the properties that once faced his fields had been sold back to him entirely at losses for the previous owners. He tore down the fences, reopened the pasture, and built a walking bridge across the shallow creek. The trail now looped past a new wooden pavilion, open to all. No gates, no keepers, just respect. Then came the final meeting. The HOA, broken and leaderless, held an emergency vote to dissolve its existing charter and elect new leadership. Only a few dozen homeowners attended, most worn out from months of uncertainty. A surprising number of ballots were proxy signed over to landowners who still lived in the southern section, most of them now leased from Miles. When the votes were counted, the result was simple. The new president of the Benton Hills HOA was Miles Benton. He didn't make a speech. He didn't gloat. He simply stood at the front, looked around the room, and said, "Let's fix what's broken." The next week, the HOA bylaws were rewritten. Annual dues were slashed. Restrictions on outdoor gardens and home paint colors were removed. All HOA surveillance was discontinued. Violations based on visual harmony were voided. The clubhouse became a public asset, managed by the co-op and staffed by volunteers. But the most important change was listed quietly on the last page of the new charter. All future decisions regarding land use, property, boundaries, or construction permits must be approved by the founding landholder of record, M. Benton. There were grumbles. A few people left the meeting early, but most stayed. They had come for luxury. They had been handed truth, and now, they lived in a place where the earth answered back. At dusk, Miles walked the trail behind the pavilion. The lights were low. Fireflies dotted the fields. From the ridge, the view remained untouched, trolling green, open sky, and not a single wall blocking the horizon. They had once tried to buy this view, then they tried to take it. Now they paid rent for the privilege of watching it, and Miles, the man they thought was just a stubborn farmer, now held the paper, the power, and the peace.